Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over genetics, the start of life, prenatal development, and the human genome. As far back as the earliest development goes, you have the gametes, which are the sex cells from the mother and the father that form a new cell at conception. I should have mentioned also that this is going to be, this PowerPoint is listed in Engage as well for you to follow along with, or just have to reference again without having to watch the whole pre-recorded lecture. You also have your zygotes, which is the new cell formed by the process of fertilization. So how would you explain the role of genes and chromosomes in creating human life? Genes are the basic unit of genetic information. Everything is coded from genes. Everything is kind of predetermined from what mom and dad carry, what they've been passed down, everything that really that the way that the description of the code of life would have formed. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid molecules, which are the substance that genes are composed of that determines the nature of every cell in the body and how it will function. And then you have chromosomes, which are rod-shaped portions of DNA that are organized into 23 pairs. So we'll get a little more into this, but if you've ever heard of Down syndrome, that's when you have an extra chromosome. The contents of a single human cell, 70,000 to 100,000 genes, 46 chromosomes, 23 chromosome pairs, all equals one human cell. So at the moment of conceptions, humans receive 70,000 to 100,000 genes, again, containing throughout 46 chromosomes on 23 pairs. So those are the big numbers you kind of have to remember when you're breaking down one human cell. Genes and chromosomes are broken down into mitosis and meiosis, which are described here. Mitosis is nearly all the cells of the body, which will contain the same 46 chromosomes as the zygote. And in meiosis, each gamete receives one of the two chromosomes that make up each of the 23 pairs. Multiple births, ones that I'm very familiar with. 2 or more for the genetic price of 1. Why do multiple births occur? The two different types of twins here are described by whether or not they will be identical or sharing an egg broken into two, or two eggs that are separately fertilized. Monozygotic twins are twins that are genetically identical, so like mine. And then the dizygotic twins, which mine were called mono-di twins because even though they're genetically identical, when the one egg was fertilized and split into two, which is how that we knew they were identical, they actually only had one placenta to share. So that's why they broke it down into that category. Fraternal twins, where there's two separate eggs that are fertilized, known as dizygotic twins, which is when one could be a boy, one could be a girl. They could come out looking completely different. And I usually get asked a lot, identical twins cannot be a boy and a girl. You'd be surprised how many times people ask that, or when I was pregnant and we didn't know what we were having, and people would say, oh, that's so cool, what if you have a boy and a girl? And I was like, well, I can't, because we know they're identical from an early ultrasound. And they were like, why can't they be identical? And I'm like, because one would be a girl and one would be a boy. That's not identical. They have to have 99% of the same genes and be literally the same person split in half. So that's the difference between those. So determining boy or girl, if sperm contributes X chromosome when it meets the ovum, child will have XX pairing on 23rd chromosome and will be a female. If sperm contributes Y chromosome, the result will be the XY pairing and will be a male. And that's how that is determined. The choice is yours, or is it? In a new technique, laser measures the DNA in sperm and enhance the chance of having a desired sex child. Should sex selection be made available to everyone? This is definitely one of those controversial topics. This is something that I love to hear from you when you're submitting your notes for this. whether or not you think that this should happen or not. I know that it's one of those topics that I usually hear a little bit of both, whether you have experience with it, if a family member has done it or wanted one particular sex over the other. It's just one of those topics that everybody kind of has their own thoughts on. Not only is the X chromosome important in determining gender, but it also is the site of genes controlling other aspects of development, which we'll learn more about as we go through. The basics of genetics, the mixing and matching of traits. In the mid-1880s, Mendel used pea plants to identify dominant and recessive traits. A dominant trait is the one that is expressed when two competing traits are present. And a recessive trait is a trait when an organism that is present but is not expressed. So the most classic example of a dominant and recessive trait is eye color. It's kind of the classic go-to when you're trying to describe the difference between the two. If mom has brown eyes, dad has blue eyes, the likelihood of the dominant trait of brown eyes is what would be passed down to the child. We're a good example of that because I have brown eyes, my husband has blue eyes, and both of the twins have brown eyes. It doesn't mean it's never happened, but it's definitely a dominant trait. The basics of genetics, mixing and matching of traits. You have your genotype and your phenotype. The nature of the information behind these is the underlying combination of genetic material which is present but not outwardly visible in an organism, and your phenotype, which is an observable trait, the trait that actually is seen. How is genetic information transmitted? So parents transmit genetic information to their offspring via the chromosomes they contribute through the gametes they provide during fertilization. You have your two types here, your homozygous, inheriting from parents similar genes for a given trait, and heterozygous, which is inheriting from parents in different forms of a gene for a given trait. An example is the transmission of phenylketonuria, that's a really tough word, PKU, also known as, inherited, which is an inherited disorder where the child is unable to process an essential amino acid called phenylalanine, which can be toxic to the brain. When both parents are carriers of the gene, the chances of an affected child is 1 in 4. There is a 50% chance that a child will be a carrier of that gene. So that is a pretty that's a pretty high number for a likelihood of inheriting that. Polygenic inheritance. A combination of multiple gene pairs is responsible for production of a particular trait. Your reaction range, which is the potential degree of variability in the actual expression of a trait due to environmental conditions. And your X-linked genes, which are considered recessive and located only on the X chromosome. So what have we learned about the mapping of human genomes? Mapping the specific sequence of genes on each chromosome is one of the most important moments in the history of genetics. It aids in the identification of disorders to which a person is susceptible and supports the field of behavioral genetics. This chart over here shows the approximate number of genes from yeast, so that live culture that you would use to make bread, to a worm, to a fly, to a human. The estimated percentage of each creature's total genes found in the humans are indicated by the dotted line. So you can see obviously humans are all the way at the top there. Behavioral genetics. This involves the study of the effects of heredity on behavior, provides better understanding of genetic code specifics that underlie human behavior and development, and seeks to identify how genetic deficits may be treated. The genetic basics of selected behavioral disorders and traits are listed here. There's an example of a behavioral trait and the current ideas of the genetic basis. So for instance, we'll come down to alcoholism, where research suggests that genes which affect the activity of neurotransmitters serotonin and GABA likely are involved in risk for alcoholism. So that kind of dependency, that addiction dependency, is definitely genetic and can be passed down. Inherited and genetic disorders when development goes awry. So a recessive gene is responsible for disorder, passed on unknowingly from one generation to the next, down to revealing itself when only by chance it is paired with another recessive gene. So again, that's something that happens by chance. And in some cases, the genes become physically damaged. So that's when something would happen kind of along the process of it going through its natural process from being inherited. These are some other inherited and genetic disorders, which we talked about already: Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, sickle cell anemia, Tay-Sachs disease, and Klinefelter syndrome. Genetic counseling. What is genetic counseling? How is it used? It helps people deal with issues related to inherited disorders. You might have heard getting a test done to see if women have the BRCA gene. That's a really common one. With breast cancer being passed down from mothers to daughters, seeing if you have that gene, kind of being proactive. Angelina Jolie was a big advocate for that. After her mother passed away from breast cancer, she had a double mastectomy because she carried the gene. It's definitely a very personal choice to do. It's one of those things where you might want to know before you decide to have children, to know what kind of things that you would pass down or what you would be in store for. That's what this kind of counseling would do to help you prepare to make that decision whether or not you wanted to do it. And it definitely uses a variety of data to determine what it entails. And then you have prenatal testing. So this is after you've already become pregnant. The amniocentesis is the process of identifying genetic deficits by examining a small sample of fetal cells drawn by a needle inserted into the amniotic fluid surrounded by the unborn fetus. This is a very controversial but also reliable test, but it's done obviously again while you're pregnant, and if they go in through your belly button. So if you have ever been pregnant or intend on being pregnant, it's definitely a scary thing to have brought to your attention, because you're thinking about a needle being inserted next to your unborn fetus that's in your stomach and obviously is risky. It's done fairly often, so it's not something that that doctors and professionals might consider as risky, but it's a very daunting procedure to have, as you can probably imagine. They have the ultrasound sonography, which is a process in which high-frequency sound waves scan the mother's womb to produce an image of the unborn baby, whose size and shape can be assessed. With my high-risk mono-die pregnancy, I had to have these very often, which was fun. I liked going in and seeing them, even though it made it a little difficult because we didn't want to know what we were having. I always had to turn away whenever they would scan the area that I might be able to see something, which again on boys would have been much more obvious. And then they have what's called the CVS, a test that's used to find genetic deficits that involves taking the samples of hair-like material that surrounds the embryos and testing it that way. Another invasive kind of procedure while you're pregnant. Additional techniques that can be used to assess the health of an unborn child if a woman is already pregnant: the embryoscopy, fetal blood sampling, sonoembryology, and sonograms. Screening for future problems. The newest role for genetic counselors involves testing to identify adult susceptibility to future disorders because of genetic abnormalities. Research and medical practitioners have moved beyond testing and counseling to actively work to change flawed genes. This is another test that's done while you're pregnant, that they can see what kind of disorders may be either developing or your chance of developing. I think I talked about this a few classes ago when this was not a choice for me to have. I had to because of how high risk I was because of the twin pregnancy. And it came back some outrageous number, like we had a 1 in 230,000 chance of them having some kind of disorder. So in the moment, you're like, oh, I guess, odds sound good. It's still very hard to interpret exactly what they're looking for or what they need. But when they don't give you much information after, that's usually a good sign. That means you don't usually have a lot to worry about. But these are actively being researched, actively being used, trying to determine what kind of things or genes develop and how early they can detect them within a pregnancy. DNA-based genetic tests. These are some currently available ones that you can have tested to see if you carry genes for. How do genetic and environmental factors interact in the development of individual traits? The role of environment in determining the expression of genes is viewing behavior as due to either genetic or environmental factors is inappropriate. A given behavior is not caused just by genetic factors, nor is it solely by environmental factors. So again, the reason I kind of point out alcoholism a couple slides ago is that's a great example for this one. Just because somebody becomes an alcoholic does not mean that they have those genes, that they were pre-programmed to become one, and vice versa. Just because somebody may have that gene, if somebody had alcohol dependency or any kind of dependency in their family, does not necessarily mean they're predetermined to have that. Behavior, kind of whether or not you have the genes, it can coincide with that, but at the same time doesn't always mean that it's going heavily one way or the other. Temperament, patterns of arousal and emotionality that represent consistent and enduring characteristics in an individual. So what causes children with the same traits to demonstrate different behaviors? Perfect example is my identical twins. They have very different personalities. They have 99.9% of the same DNA, so to say that they have the same traits is an understatement, but definitely have different behaviors, and that's just the way that they are developing. Traits are determined by a combination of genetic and environmental factors. I always go back to saying, and I know I've probably said this before too, that one of them was taken from us right after they were born. He had to go right up to the NICU while the other one was allowed to stay with us. And we feel like that has contributed a lot to his independence and his not need to be as much of a Klingon as my other one, which I know I've called him in the past a suckerfish and things like that. He's definitely a little bit more clingy and a little less independent. And we think that that might have kind of set the stage for it early in life. But again, the combination of the genes that they were each given as well as their environmental factors all do play a role. The interactions of factors reflected in many traits determined by combination of both genetic and environmental factors, as well as genotype provides particular range within which phenotype may achieve expression, all coincide with multifactorial transmission. How do researchers study the interaction of genetic and environmental development? In non-human animal studies, scientists, observe animals with similar genetic backgrounds in different environments to determine effects of specific environmental stimulation, and also examine animals bred with different genetic background on particular traits in identical environments to determine the role of genetics. Another very interesting field to kind of trace and follow how the genes are passed down in non-human animals. Now I know this would come up a lot, so in almost every lesson we'll be talking a little bit about how nature versus nurture plays a role. In this case, when nurture becomes nature, transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is life experiences that can change parts of DNA that switch individual genes on and off, and alterations can be passed to future generations. So these kind of almost interferences a little bit with caused by life experiences that can actually mold and shape new genes to be passed down. So that is possible for things to change. So again, going back to kind of the dependency example, it could potentially cease at some point if that wasn't if that was something that was able to be altered and passed down in a more favorable way. Contrasting relatedness and behavior. So adoption, twin, and family studies. Twin studies are known as natural experiments. Inherited backgrounds of identical monozygotic twins are the same. Any variations in behavior are due to environmental factors. And the dizygotic twins are generically no more similar than siblings born at different times. So again, those can be a boy and a girl, two totally different people that look totally different. We have friends that have fraternal twins. One has a completely different hair color than the other, and just they look like they might not even be related. That's how different fraternal or dizygotic twins can be. High association on a particular trait between biological parents and their children, but a weaker association between adoptive parents and their children. And you can kind of see why. There's a lot to determining that. The influence of genetics and the environment on physical traits, intelligence, and personality. The role of genetics plays physical traits and family resemblances. Monozygotic twins are most likely to share physical characteristics. Height and obesity have genetic components, and blood pressure, respiration rates, and age at death show strong genetic influences as well. I know that in my family, blood pressure is definitely one of those genes that has been passed on from generation to generation. My brother is not even in his 40s yet and already has it. I'm lucky that I haven't yet. I've always had pretty good blood pressure, so I'm hoping that that passes right by me, but those are the kinds of questions you'll get asked regularly at physicals and things like that when you start determining family history, just for medical professionals to keep an eye on what potentially they need to be looking for. Personality, born to be outgoing, maybe not. How do we know which personality traits reflect genetics? Direct examination of genes is a novel-seeking gene, twin studies, 2 big 5 traits linked to genetic factors. We'll talk more about big 5 too, those big 5 traits that neurocentrism and extroversion kind of contribute to as well. Intelligence, more research, more controversy. The more that we learn about the role that genetics plays in passing down intelligence, the more controversial it becomes. The closer the genetic link between 2 individuals, the greater correspondence of their overall IQ scores. There is intensifying influence on inherited factors with increasing age, and environmental factors such as exposure to books, good educational experiences, and intelligent peers are influential on intelligence. My husband and I would get this a lot when we were pregnant, that we were going to have smart kids because we were both educators, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything. We both worked hard for our education. I've never had an IQ test before. I don't know if he has or not, but that would be an interesting aspect of research to try and figure out how exactly smart they would be based on us. Genetics and IQ chart here, graph, showing the genetic overlap with the relationship, as if, for examples, children reared together, a foster parent and child, siblings reared apart, parent and child, siblings reared together, fraternal twins of different sex, fraternal twins of same sex, identical twins reared apart, and identical twins rearing together. You can see that those 2 are significantly high. The genetic overlap is a little lower on the identical twins reared apart, but reared together, it's pretty much almost 100% on both sides, the genetic overlap and the relationship. How do we know which personality traits reflect genetics? Inheriting traits. Personality traits related to most closely genetic factors. So your social potency all the way down to your social closeness. You can see the percentage gets lower with each one of those factors. And even less basic personality traits are linked to genetics. So political attitudes, those kinds of things, religious interests and values, those kind of learned behaviors along the way, and things that you're able to make your own, kind of shape your own ideas around based off of your education and knowledge. Cultural differences. This is the mean behavioral scores for Caucasian, American, Irish, and Chinese 4-month-old infants. So all the same age, showing a behavior in the different cultures. And you can see that the American children are kind of have a much higher scores in most of these categories. Vocalizing is pretty similar between American and Irish, and much lower for Chinese, while smiling is a little bit more average between the 3. And that source is, you can see right there, is from 1993, so it would be interesting to see when that was a little bit more updated than that, but that just goes to show a little bit of some typical behaviors within infants throughout different cultures. And another question to think about when thinking about this is, does this prove cultural, philosophical traditions are affected by genes? And you're welcome, again, to include that in your notes if you feel like addressing that. here's nature and nurture again. What role do nature and nurture play in the development of psychological disorders? If genetics were the sole cause of psychological disorders, the risk for identical twins would be 100%. However, other factors account for disorders ranging from structural abnormalities in the brain to a biochemical imbalance. Several other psychological disorders have been shown to relate, at least in part, to genetic factors. So you can see that kind of has to be a little bit of both, nature and nurture. So this breaks down the genetics of schizophrenia, which is a disorder that you typically would not see or be able to diagnose, at least until adolescence and the higher end of adolescence. The lifetime risk of developing schizophrenia is the chart that they're showing here, the degree of risk versus on the left-hand side here, you see the general population all the way down to twins again, which is the highest. The psychological disorder of schizophrenia has clear genetic components. If somebody in your family has it poses a much higher risk of being passed down. The closer the genetic links between someone with schizophrenia and another family member, it's more likely that the other person will also develop schizophrenia. In what ways do genes influence the environment? The genetic endowment provided to children by their parents determines their genetic characteristics and actively influences their environment. Ways child's genetic predisposition may influence his or her environment is children seek environmental opportunities that best connect with genetically determined abilities. Children pay less attention to environmental aspects that are less compatible with their genetic endowment. And children's genetically driven temperament may evoke some environmental influences. So you'll see that those, the bold words in each one of those sentences kind of stand out a little bit, how they seek those opportunities. They pay less attention to environmental aspects and evoke some environmental influences. At least their temperament does. The prenatal stages of development are shown here. The moment of conception, which is fertilization, the process by which a sperm and an ovum, the male and the female gametes respectively join to form a single new cell, or sometimes double. Prenatal period consists of 3 phases: the germinal, the embryonic, and the fetal, which we will explore in a much more detailed PowerPoint next class. Here is the anatomy of the female reproductive organs. It's just a specific chart, I guess, showing you what each of the components are. The germinal stage is from fertilization to 2 weeks. Again, we're going to kind of look into this a little bit more in depth next class. But this is when everything is just initially happening. The germinal stage is characterized by the methodical cell division and the attachment of the organism to the wall of the uterus. 3 days after fertilization, the zygote consists of 32 cells, a number that doubles by the next day. A lot happens in these first 2 weeks. Within a week, you'll see the zygote multiplies from 100 to 150. And the cells become specialized, with some forming a protective layer around the zygote. It is the first and shortest stage because while a lot happens during it, a lot more happens after. Development really starts to speed up for a while after that. And then you have your embryonic stage, which is 2 to 8 weeks. At 8 weeks, the fetus is about 1 inch long, and the layers here that are listed here are starting to form. This is when you would be able to see what looked like a little comma in a sonogram, but a baby would already have a spinal cord, and there are things like their liver and their circulatory system are already starting to develop. And then your fetal stage, which is 8 weeks to birth. This is when typically what would be considered a normal pregnancy, not like a high risk or anything like that, would be when you would first get an actual ultrasound through your stomach, not transvaginally, where you'd have to do that anytime before 8 weeks, because this is when it would be the most visible. So now the fetus is growing very rapidly, increasing 20 times from before 8 weeks. At 4 months, it's weighing around an average of 4 ounces. 7 months, around 3 pounds. And at the time of birth, the average child weighs over just 7 pounds. And that's typically if you make it to a full term, which is anywhere between 37 and 40 weeks. A little bit more about the fetal stage. Hemispheres grow rapidly. Interconnections between neurons become more complex. Neurons become coated myelin. Released hormones lead to increasing differentiation of male and female fetuses, and body proportions are changing dramatically. It was kind of fun to track what size they were in an app I had that compared the size of the fetus to a fruit every week, and it was always constantly changing and getting a little bigger. I remember when it was like the size of a poppy seed, and then one week it was the size of a mango. It was kind of fun to see how much they grew in such a short amount of time, it felt like. Some issues that couples face with respect to pregnancy. Obviously, infertility is a huge one. One that has become much more known and discussed, and this is not necessarily a reason to not have a baby anymore. It's there are so many infertility treatments that are listed here that's making it possible for people who never thought they could have kids or may genetically not be able to have kids actually have it happen. This is something we would usually discuss in class, but if you want to include this in your notes, the ethical and legal issues surrounding the use of surrogate mothers, in vitro fertilization, which is again the IVF treatments, and sex selection techniques. These are always interesting topics to discuss in class. Surrogate mothers, for those of you who don't know, are a woman other than, for an example, we'll say if a husband and wife were struggling to get pregnant and it was determined that the mother was the one that was going to be having the issues of either carrying the baby or conceiving the baby, they would find a surrogate mother that the father would take his sperm and take an egg from his wife, and they would plant it in another person where the baby would be able to grow and thrive, and the mother would have her, or the woman would have her, but it would genetically be that other couple's child still. That's what a surrogate mother is. And in vitro is, again, you can go back and look at the ones listed, but any kind of outside treatment to help you as a couple be able to conceive. And sex selection, again, was trying to predetermine the sex of your child before you even get pregnant. Miscarriages and abortions. Miscarriage is also known as a spontaneous abortion. It's actually much more common than you might realize. 15 to 20% of pregnancies end in a miscarriage, and it's usually attributable to some genetic abnormality. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. Sometimes pregnancies just don't stick, and they call them non-viable pregnancies. There's a lot of terms for it, why it's actually more common for a pregnancy to not go full term than for it to. I remember also reading a study one time saying how many women actually are pregnant in their lives and never even know, and just have miscarriages before anything was even really. So an egg could be fertilized and you could miscarry it without really ever even knowing it. It's pretty interesting. And then abortion, about 40 million pregnancies worldwide end in abortion, with a wide range of after effects. Mixed research findings around this. Some people aren't willing to really divulge on it. So it's one of those things that is also constantly being researched and trying to figure out the components too. What are some threats to the fetal environment and what can be done about them? Teratogen is a factor that produces a birth defect. Timing and quantity of exposure are crucial. Generally, largest effects during rapid prenatal development, and specific teratogen sensitivity related to racial and cultural backgrounds. And here are some factors in prenatal environment: age, diet, health, mother's prenatal support, use of drugs and alcohol, age playing the lowest role, use of drugs and alcohol playing the highest role. That's what that chart's trying to show with the steps there. So mother's age, more women are giving birth later in life than 2 or 3 decades ago due to societal transformations. Childbirth delay has potential consequences for mother's and child's health. They call anything above 36 a geriatric pregnancy, which is really funny to think about because 36 is not really that old, but it is definitely starting to be the time when a pregnancy would need to be paid a little bit more attention to. Childbirth delay has potential consequences. I think I already read that, sorry. Prematurity and low birth rate are more likely. Increase in incidence of Down syndrome is possible. The risk, that doesn't mean the risk doesn't exist for young women, but it just definitely there's more chance of it happening, and the statistics show more in higher aged women. Mother's diet definitely plays a role. You've probably heard all the things that mothers or expecting mothers, pregnant women shouldn't eat. Things like raw fish, unpasteurized cheese, deli meats, things like that. Most knowledge of environmental factors that affect developing fetuses comes from the study of the mother. There are ways to counteract types of maternal malnourishment that affect prenatal development. They'll say things like if you are planning on getting pregnant, you'd want to start something like a prenatal vitamin, something high in folic acid to help develop a really sturdy womb, even up to months before you conceive can be really beneficial. Prenatal support is very important. High mortality rates for babies of adolescent mothers reflects physiological problems related to mother's young age, adverse social and economic factors which can affect infant health. That usually means that the education and the support isn't there when they're at that age where they may not be thinking about what the best thing for the baby would be. Mothers who eat the right foods, maintain an acceptable weight, and who exercise appropriately maximize the chances of having a healthy baby. A mother's diseases may affect a developing fetus depending on when the illness is contracted. This is a big thing right now with COVID, wondering women who have tested positive for it and are pregnant, how it's going to be, how it's going to affect the pregnancy. Those are all things that they're still researching. Things like having an addiction when you're pregnant is something to take into consideration, whether or not you'd need to be on something like Suboxone to try and have your withdrawals at a minimum, and so the baby doesn't also get born with a dependency to whatever you were dependent on. And this kind of goes into that a little bit more. Mother's use of many kinds of drug poses serious risk to the unborn child, even prescription drugs. They pose equally great and sometimes even greater risk for environments of prenatal children. If you've ever seen a picture or heard an example of a baby that's born addicted to, let's say, heroin, for example, you usually see a very low birth weight. They're usually in neonatal intensive units, also known as the NICU. They need a lot of extra support. They're usually in the hospital for a little while. It's definitely any kind of outside substance like that is a very difficult and detrimental thing to be using when you're pregnant. They can result in things like fetal alcohol syndrome, also known as FAS, and fetal alcohol effects, FAE, which are both disorders caused by the use of alcohol during pregnancy. But fetal alcohol syndrome can result in things like mental retardation and delayed growth, whereas the fetal alcohol effects is just what some children will display, things like the way that they might appear, the way that things might have developed. There might be traits that are a little bit more obvious within their face and their eyes and things like that would be the result of having fetal alcohol syndrome. Do fathers affect the prenatal environment? Absolutely, 100%. Fathers' behavior may influence prenatal environment by smoking, use of alcohol and illegal drugs, physical or emotional abuse to the pregnant wives. There's a lot of studies that show that the more supportive the father is, the more involved, the more kind of he takes on a pregnancy role in as much of a way as he can in turn create much healthier pregnancies, much healthier babies. Smoking obviously plays a role because secondhand smoke is terrible to inhale. So even the mother's not smoking herself, but she's around her partner who is, that can contribute as well. And then obviously just any kind of abuse, and whether they're abusing drugs or abusing the pregnant woman, it plays a huge role. Okay, so that wraps up the genetics slide. This is where I would ask questions. You can feel free to ask me questions, either through email, or I can put up a discussion board for this PowerPoint if you want to get questions out that way. I think there's actually a link within Engage called Ask the Instructor. You're more than welcome to use that if you have any questions about this. But this will be considered your Chapter 2 notes. No, I'm sorry. This will be considered your Chapter 3 notes. This PowerPoint was listed as Chapter 2 at the beginning, which is why it says this here, but you should have already done your Chapter 2 notes from last week. So this is going to be your Chapter 3 notes. I also want to make sure that everybody has by now seen the guidelines for the presentations that are listed in Engage, and just be aware that this Thursday we'll have a test on chapters 1 and 2, which will not include this, even though it says Chapter 2 in the beginning. This is considered your Chapter 3 and is Chapter 3 in your book. So the things that will be on your Chapter 1 and 2 test are the things that we've gone over up until now. So be prepared for that on Thursday. Obviously, it will be open book. It will be held through Engage, but I will be on Zoom, and you are welcome to as well the whole time. So you can ask questions. I'll be available. And you'll have the whole class to do it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I appreciate your willingness to view it, and I hope if you have questions, you'll reach out, and thank you.